In this presentation, we're going to focus on the ego. And in the first part of this presentation, we start with defining the ego. And basically, the ego is the self defined as a story. Then we move on to the building blocks of the ego. How do we construct an ego? Next, we discuss the expression of the ego. So how do we know that we're operating on the basis of our ego? And finally, we explore ways to transcend the ego. Can we move beyond the negative workings of the ego? And if so, how can we do this? And here we introduce also the role of mindfulness. So in the first part, we will start with the ego defined, so the self as story. So before we continue, I would like to do a very brief exercise. I would like you to explain who you are to someone. Maybe your neighbor, if there is somebody physically present, or maybe an imaginary person. But try to explain to this person who you are. You have about 2 minutes to tell the other the most important things there are to know about you. See if you can picture this. What would you tell the other person about yourself? Most of the time we get answers like, hey, I'm John, I'm 24 years old, I'm extrovert, I have a nice house in Denver, I'm good at sports, I'm a manager, I like watching football, and so on. So what follows are a lot of self-descriptions. And the main question here is, do these answers that we get truly say something about who other people are? In other words, when we tell people about who we are we really revealing them who we truly are? So this presentation is about the ego. And the ego is a quite complex construct, so I'll try my best to explain it. But you could define the ego as a mental construct of ourself. So the ego is a mental construction. It's something that we create in our head. And I think the simplest way of looking at the ego is to see it as a story we construct to define who we are. It's a story about me. And we can say that the ego is an image that we hold about ourselves, who we believe we are. And I stress the word believe here because the ego is not the same as reality. It's what we believe we are. In the field of psychology, there are a lot of synonyms used for the ego, and the most commonly used synonyms are a conceptualized self, a narrative identity, or a constructivist approach of the self. These are the three most commonly used words to refer to the ego. In this presentation, we will keep continuing to refer to this story of the self as the ego. So, as I said before, it's a story about me. The ego is a story about yourself, and it's actually built throughout daytime. It's the internal voice, the internal chatter in our mind about our experiences and what they mean. Examples of thoughts that are actually build our ego are, I'm not good at math, I'm smart, my freckles make me ugly, nobody likes me, I'm better than you. All these self-statements are in fact reflecting beliefs that we have about ourselves and thus reflect our created identity. These are all examples. And what we do in general to build our ego is basically, first we start formulating our own life history. So, for instance, when you ask people, like, tell me a bit about yourself, many people start talking about their past. When I was 6, this happened. I was treated in this way by those people, and because this happened, I became this and this. So for instance, because I was treated in a negative way by my parents, I became very aggressive, and so on and so on. I acted this way because I'm an extrovert, or I act this way because I'm really good with people. What we do is we build a story about what happened in the past. And we repeat the story over and over again to ourselves and to other people, and we believe the story to be true. What we also do is we define our dominant attributes. And this means that we come up with all kinds of labels about our characteristics. So for instance, I'm a person who is really good with sports, or who is really passionate about this, or who is better than other people in this. And, whatever it is that we do, we have all kinds of attributes like intelligence or beauty or whatever it is that we believe we possess or not possess. So we define ourselves in all kinds of labels and attributes. If you ask a person to just complete a sentence, I'm a person who, it can generate literally hundreds of statements about who people believe they are. And what we also do is we not only have all these ideas about our characteristics like introvert, extrovert, intelligent, not intelligent, attractive, smart, whatever it is, but we also evaluate these attributes. In other words, we also have a sense of whether these are right or not right. I don't like about myself that I'm so prudent, or that I'm not taking any risks, or compared to others, I'm really kind, or I'm really open, or we also have an opinion about the supposed attributes that we have. And finally, what we do, and this is something I notice often in coaching practice, is we construct cause and effect relations between the things that happen in life. When I was young, a friend of mine told me this, and therefore I got scared, and therefore I developed an anxiety for this, and that's why I'm here, and because I was treated in this way. We all build some kind of a story and some kind of relationship between events, and sometimes there is a truth in them, sometimes it's not true at all, and it doesn't matter so much. But the thing is, we believe these stories about how things went and what they meant to be absolutely true. And this is also reflected in things like, because I did this, the other thing happened. It was because I said it in this way to him that he reacted this way, and this was why we broke up, and all kinds of explanations that we build about why things happened and why we did it and what they tell us about ourselves and so on. And basically, these are all stories. And again, they may be true or not true or partly true, or in any case, they're in most cases incomplete, and in many cases even just flawed. This is what we also know from research on memories. Many memories that we have are flawed, and they represent only one way of looking at reality. So before we continue and to demonstrate the relative nature of all these things, I want to do a very brief exercise. I want you to consider the personal attribute intelligence. As we saw before, people sometimes, the ego is characterized by all kinds of supposed attributes. So some people say, I am intelligent. No, I want you to think of intelligent, and I want you to, think of intelligent and tell me if you believe that in order to call yourself intelligent, it is crucial to be mathematically skilled, verbally proficient, or creative. When I do this exercise with psychology students, and I ask them okay, do you believe you need to be mathematically skilled in order to call yourself intelligent? Only a few people raise their hand, the great majority doesn't believe so. And then I ask them, what would happen if I would pose the very same question to a group of people who are highly mathematically skilled, a group of students who study mathematics? Probably 90% of you or even more would raise their hand. And this example illustrates that for many traits, such as intelligence, maturity, idealism, whatever it is really difficult to pin down which habits, characteristics, actions, and achievements best reflect them. And they're very subjective, It's really difficult to call yourself intelligent, because what is intelligent in the first place? Another exercise to demonstrate the relativity of all those things. Imagine you would be the only person on this planet in the whole universe. So you would be the only living creature on this planet in the universe. You were all by yourself, Would you be tall? Are you smart? Are you handsome or pretty? The thing is, when you try to answer these questions, you can soon come to the realization that you just can't tell. And why is that? Because nothing is absolute. You know, you cannot tell whether you're tall or not if there is nobody else to compare to. You know, everything exists in relation to something else. So it is based on the comparisons we make and the way we interpret things and events. In order to call yourself tall, there must be at least one person that is less tall compared to you. So this shows us that calling yourself intelligent or tall is not an objective truth, it's just a result of a comparison. If people ask me, like, are you introvert? I say, depends, you know, sometimes I am, and sometimes I'm not. And again, it also depends on who I compare myself to. Compared to some people, I'm really extrovert. Compared to some people, I'm really introvert. So these self-descriptions are subjective. In many cases, they're just flawed because they just don't represent an absolute reality. So let's focus now on how we build the ego. How is this story of ourselves constructed throughout our lives? The main process that is responsible for the construction of ourselves is called identification. And identification means that we make something the same. It comes from Latin. You know, in Latin there is the word idem, which means same, and facere, which means make. And if you combine them, you make something just the same. And when we identify with something, it means that we make it the same as me. We identify with something, it is added to our basket of me, to our story of who I am. And once we identify with something, it becomes an inseparable part of ourselves. So this means that when I identify, for instance, with my car, I believe that the car truly says something about who I am. If I drive an expensive car, I truly believe that because it is expensive, it says something about, for instance, my worth as a human being. It is something that the car is attached to me. And the only one who does this, of course, is your mind. It's the ratio. It's the rational mind that creates these stories and identifies with things. What are examples? Well, first of all, the most easy example is a possession. We can identify with the things we have. For instance, I am rich. You know, so the part of the self-description that people have, the story about themselves is that they're rich. Or I wear designer clothes. Or I drive a big car. In these examples, possessions become an inseparable part of our self-story. They're mistaken for who we are. Another example is achievement, a very common one. You know, I got promoted, I ran the fastest, I created a successful business. As if having a successful business is truly about who you are. But if we become unable to see the difference between what we do and who we are, then we call, you know, this process identification, because we identify, the achievement becomes part of us. A very well-known example, of course, is a job position, a title. I'm a doctor. I'm really important. I'm a manager. I'm a social worker. All these job descriptions that we have, these roles that we take, are being added again to the story that we created about ourselves. Another example, and this one is maybe a bit more difficult, but the same principle applies here. Beliefs, all kinds of beliefs. I know a lot. I believe that I know a lot. I'm not somebody to mess with. It's just a belief that people have or created. I'm not good at convincing people. These are all beliefs about ourselves, and when we start believing them, they become true. They become really, they actually contribute to a sense of self. And again, beliefs can be positive and negative, as you can see here. But it doesn't matter so much. It's all about believing them to be true. Appearance, another very common example. If we identify with appearance, it means that our appearance tells us something about who we are. I look good. This is a very positive ego, what we create by this identification. Or on a negative side, I'm ugly. This contributes to negative ego. So this part of the ego is negative. I'm attractive. The thing is, identifications are highly personal. So person A may identify strongly with his possessions, and person B may identify most strongly with his appearance. But the thing is, it doesn't matter so much. The effects on behavior are most likely to be the same, as we will discuss later. But what we also see with identifications is that they can change during life. So they're not very static. Sometimes they are, but they can also change. Maybe you remember a time when you were young, you were really identified yourself as strongly defined in terms of your group membership, the friends you had as a teenager. But once you became older, yourself became more defined by the achievements. The money you make, or the job title you have, whatever it is. And they can both be positive and negative. So we can, many people believe the ego is something positive, like a boosted ego or a narcissistic person who has a big ego. You can also have a very negative ego, believing that you're not worth anything because you're not beautiful, or you're not worth loving, or you don't have a lot of stuff, or whatever it is. You can also have a very negative self-image, a negative story about the self. To clarify things, I think it's nice to use a metaphor. And a metaphor that I often use to clarify the workings and the principles of the ego is the shopping cart metaphor. So let's take the elements that we discussed previously, like a car, a job title, appearance, and use this metaphor to explain the working of the ego. So when we take a shopping cart, we can say what we actually do when we identify with things is that we mistake the content of the shopping cart with who we are. And what we do when we identify with things is basically we put things like a car, a job title, appearance in the shopping cart. And we believe that these things truly represent us. So identification is simply putting things in your shopping cart. And as a result of this, obviously, we start comparing our shopping cart with other people. We drive around and we, oh my God, what is he having? And as long as we're, successful in a way, as long as our car is bigger than the car of the other person we encounter, we feel good, We may even feel like proud or whatever. But as you can imagine, once we encounter a person who has a bigger car than we have, we may feel threatened because we feel that the car of the other person means that this person is better than we are, because the car has become an inseparable part of ourselves. In reality, of course, the car is just a vehicle that this person owns, but to us, because we identify with it, it says something about the self. And the big car of the other person is a direct threat to our own identity, because it means this person is worth more than I am. We will also continue to use this metaphor later on, but I think it's a nice way to illustrate the complex workings of the ego. So how is the ego developed? Well, the ego is shaped and developed by many forces outside the self, and it's a bit beyond the scope of today's presentation to discuss all of these factors, but here we will present some very important factors, and we start with the culture that people live in, the parenting that they receive, the type of parents, the norms and rules of parents, the media they're exposed to, the school, religion, and these are only a few again. But what I want to do is discuss them one by one and show some important ways in which they contribute to the ego development. So the first one is culture. How does the culture contribute to the formation of the ego? Well, obviously, what a culture does, it provides a standard. As soon as we're born, we enter a context that is greatly shaped by the norms and rules and habits of our culture. The food we're exposed to, the type of music we're exposed to, the way we deal with other people, the type of social interaction, and so on. This is something we're being programmed with. What culture also, of course, does is it provides standards or norms for normal behavior. And for people who have traveled around the globe, they know that depending on where you are, the norms for normal behavior are really different. They can be very different. They vary among many countries. But we grow up in one culture and we believe that these norms are, the absolute way of doing things. But there are also, of course, norms for moral behavior. What is supposed to be moral behavior? This is strongly dependent on the culture that people live in. Although, of course, there are like global norms, but these can also very much vary depending on the region one lives in. So this is what culture does. It also provides some kind of context here for what is right and what is wrong, of course. Parenting, the same principles. What parents obviously do unconsciously often is, offering values, explicitly or implicitly, values like working hard. It's really important to work hard, or to have an honorable job, or to be loyal. So parents, by, living by example, or by just explicitly stating these values, they also provide a context for the self to be compared to. If your parents believe that working hard is an important value and it determines whether you're good or not good, you can easily imagine that once you grow up and you start to internalize this value, that your self-image, the level of positivity or negativity, may be influenced by these values. So if you work hard, you may feel good about yourself. So you strive for having a self-image that is about working hard. Another way is, of course, by offering beliefs. Parents have a lot of beliefs that they're often also not aware of, that they also impose on their kids. Things like, you should have respect for the local worthies, or men are not allowed to cry. Whatever the beliefs are, these beliefs are often, picked up by kids and also integrated into what they believe is a decent sense of self. The media, everybody knows the media is full of norms, If we look at television, we were confronted with extremely beautiful people, successful people, and indirectly what this exposure does to us, it shows us that what we call beauty is often associated with a thin body. So the media provides beauty ideals. Money, money is often considered to be a marker of success, something that is exposed by the media. Achievements, also people who are, on top of whatever they're in the media. They're, being interviewed as the experts and so on. And I think when we look at commercials, I think this is the most obvious, because people in commercials are most of the time people that are considered to be successful. And by buying this product, we buy a bit of the success of this person. We can associate with this person because he's using the same shaving foam as I am, So school, another one. What does school do? Of course, school provides norms. Intellectual abilities are the norm for many schools. So this means that what we believe to be good is often very obvious, becomes very obvious just by looking at what is taught at schools, There is a very strong focus on thinking in many schools, and this makes one believe that perhaps thinking and being what we call intellectual is the most important marker for success, and I think this is also very easy to see when we compare the most highly valued courses in general on high schools or elementary school. It's about mathematics and language, and of course those are important. But in many cases, things like creativity and expression are considered less important compared to these more intellectual abilities. So what school does is, in the same way, it provides norms. There's a lot of focus on comparing. It's very common to compare scores between students, to compare who's the best, to offer extra attention for people that are better, that score higher because they belong to the top 5% of students, and so on. So the school also provides a context, a norm for what is right and what is wrong, and what a good self should be. And religion, of course, again, it provides norms, rules for being good, a good human being. What does it do? Like the 10 Commandments, all kinds of explicit and less explicit rules, but also general beliefs about human beings. For instance, human beings are sinners or created through the eye of God, or whatever it is. There are all kinds of beliefs that can impact on a very fundamental level what kind of self-image one is striving for. So what we discussed so far is all kinds of factors that influence the ego development. And what they actually do is they influence the development of the ego in two ways. Either these things like school and media and so on, they provide explicit rules about what it means to be a good human being or to be successful, or they stimulate the formation of own rules. And once we are exposed to these rules, we start to internalize them. We start to perceive them as objective truth. We start to see, the idea that beauty is the most important thing to be really the most important thing. And we try to live up to this experience, and we try to create a self-image that either matches this, or if it's unable to match this image, we feel sorry and we feel negative about ourselves. And this is, in a nutshell, how all these factors can influence the formation of what we call the ego. So now let's focus on the expression of the ego. How do we know when we're operating on the basis of the ego? Well, there are many ways of actually finding out if we're operating on the basis of the ego. And the easiest one, I think, is when we're operating what we call from an outside-in focus. An outside-in focus means that we're strongly focusing on the outside world. So somebody who's really focused on the outside world is concerned with questions like, how do I compare to other people? How do I do compare to other people? What should I feel right now? What is appropriate according to the standard? What are norms for success? So what you feel here is that there is a strong focus on guidance from the outside world. The self is pretty much dependent on all kinds of rules and norms from the outside world. And this can be displayed here through this picture. So the inner circle represents the self, and the light gray circle around it represents the world outside the self. And when we focus, when there's a strong outside-in focus, are actually the feelings that we experience about ourselves and our definition of the self is mainly based on things outside ourselves. Another expression of the ego is fear. And this is easy to explain because once we start identifying with something, this has a strong impact on ourselves and the environment. So let's take the shopping cart metaphor again. Once we put the car into the shopping cart, if we put this big Mercedes or whatever it is that we're driving into the shopping cart, it means, of course, that it is important because it's part of me. The car, the expensive car, is part of my identity, so it has a high level of importance. It's part of me. How important can things become, And as soon as we put it there, we also realize that inevitably we may also lose it. We may lose our car. We may, lose our job and cannot afford our car anymore. So we realize that our shopping cart, whatever is in there, it can be, taken away. So we realize that what we identify with can be taken away. And examples include, I can get fired or I can fail to succeed. I can lose my car. If I identify with my appearance, I may realize that I will get older and less beautiful. And objectively, this is not something to worry about. It happens to everybody. But as if we become identified with our appearance, it means that we become less valuable, and therefore a very strong fear can emerge. A fear that actually stimulates us to control. It forces us and it motivates us to exert control because, we don't want to, lose those things. So we can say control in general is the ego's way to deal with fear. Control is a very mental, cognitive trick that we apply to deal with things that we experience that are negative. So, for instance, the person who is identified with his appearance may try to control his appearance by, plastic surgery. This is a way to, prevent the self from getting less beautiful. A person who is highly identified with possessions, he has this very strong fear of losing those possessions. So what he may do, the way he exerts control, may be by insurance or by, putting on cameras or whatever it is, and in a more I think recognizable way. In fact, when we experience emotions and we really are, afraid of letting the emotions take over and so on, and see what happens if we just allow these emotions to be present, we try to suppress them. So suppression is also just a way of the ego, you could say, to deal with things that we are afraid of, to lose or to manipulate us or to, whatever happens. Another expression of the ego is what we call wanting more. And this makes sense again, if something determines me, then the more of it means a stronger me. So if I believe that my car, to take this simple example to illustrate this point, if my car says something about who I am, and the more expensive the car, the better I am, then a bigger car means a better me, simply put. So more money, to use another example, means a richer I, a better I. More beautiful means a more attractive I. More achievements means a more successful I. So wanting more can be the result of the ego who wants to strengthen itself and become more. And why is it? Because we realize that when we add something to our basket, when we add something to the shopping cart, it guarantees that we're, in any case, not being less than we are now at this moment. And also, it helps us to become even more, to when we compare ourselves to others, to be the one that is better off. When I can, get rid of my Mercedes and buy a Ferrari instead, when I compare myself to people, the chances are really high that I will come out favorably in most of the comparisons. So when we add something, we can strengthen our ego, and this can be positive or negative. So in some cases, as strange as it may sound, we put more negative stuff in our shopping cart. For instance, a person who is identified with his victim role, with his problems, as strange as it may sound, this person may look for further experiences and things that actually strengthen this victim role, because it is who he believes he truly is. And when he's confronted with people that may suffer even more extensively, he feels threatened. So for instance, this person is confronted with another person who says, okay, I'm really sorry for you, but I just met another guy and, his condition is even worse than yours. The person, the victim, the person who is identified with his victim role may feel threatened by this. May respond like, no, this can't be, he doesn't know what it's like to be me, it can't be worse than I am, because the other person who is even more victim than he is, as strange as it may sound, is threatening to him. So, again, we may want more, either of positive or negative things. Another expression of the ego is jealousy. If something that we're identified with is being threatened, we experience jealousy. So if I am identified with my big expensive car and I have put this in my shopping cart, to use the metaphor again, and I encounter a person who is driving a bigger car than I am, so who has a bigger car in his shopping cart, I'm threatened. Because to me it feels like he's better than I am, because it's part of my identity. In reality, of course, this is a completely different story. What's happening here is that the other person just has a more expensive vehicle. But to the ego, because it's identified with it, it feels that this other person is better than he is, because the car is an inseparable part of the self. What we see in research on jealousy, indeed, and this confirms this whole statement, is that jealousy occurs when the object of jealousy, so the object of jealousy can be the performance of another person or the car or whatever it is, concerns our own self-definition. And what it can do, it can boost our motivation to protect the ego or increase our own ego. So to give you an example of this, imagine somebody is highly identified with his, with him being a musician. So this person believes, I am a musician. Imagine this scenario. Scenario 1, a friend becomes a successful dancer. What's happening here is what we call in social psychology, probably he will be basking in reflected glory. And this means he will be very proud of his friend. He will tell other people, oh my God, you can't imagine what just happened to my friend. He did this and this. So he's also being very proud, and he's feeling good about it. But in the second scenario, imagine that this friend creates a #1 hit on the radio. If this person becomes highly successful as a musician, in this scenario, because being a musician is part of his identity, it's very likely to elicit a sense of jealousy. And this has everything to do with the very fact that creating music, being a musician, more specifically, is part of the identity. And this is being threatened because the performance of the friend actually means he's better than you are. He's more successful. He's a better human being. So maybe you can also apply this knowledge to yourself. Maybe you can remember the last time you were jealous. Can you think of this? And maybe you can also analyze who and what you were jealous of. Can you see what it is, like a role or a status or a characteristic or whatever, that you identify with, that causes you to resonate with the accomplishment or situation of the other person? Can you see what it is that is part of your identity that caused you to experience this jealousy? Okay, yet another expression of the ego is what we call defensive behavior. Of course, the ego is very sensitive to criticism. And what we often see is that once people receive negative feedback on something they identified with, so when they receive negative feedback on something they have put in the shopping cart, the ego perceives this as an attack on the self, because what is put in the shopping cart, the things we're identified with, is confused with the self. So if you attack the car of that person, if you tell this person, I don't like your car, the person perceives this as, I don't like you, because the car is him. There is no separation between the two. So it's really difficult then to distinguish the feedback about what's going on, or the thing one is identified with, and the self. So let's take a look at another example of how the ego can, induce a lot of defensive behavior. So reality is that a person writes books. So I write books. And this person who writes books, gets feedback from a reviewer. And this reviewer said, his book is no good. The perception of the ego of this person, when this person is identified with writing, he may say, I am a writer. So being a writer is part of his self-definition. And if this is so, what happens in case of, the negative feedback that he gets from the reviewer, to him it is perceived as, I am not good. Whereas in reality, of course, the person says, I dislike your book. I don't like your book. But your book is no good, actually. And the ego, because there is no separation between the book, being a writer, and so on, and the self, perceives this feedback as a direct attack on the self. I am no good. And as a result, this person may become very aggressive or really hostile towards the reviewer. And this is a very typical, I think, reaction that stems from the ego. I've seen many people become highly verbally aggressive when they were attacked on something they identified with. I've been to conferences, and when people provided critical feedback on a certain theory that a certain professor came up with, I've seen sometimes professors explode because the critique on their theory is perceived as critique on the self. It's not something that is seen as separate from each other. And this is a very common effect of a strong ego. The last one, judgment. Of course, many judgments that we have reflect personal identifications. If I believe that, having an expensive car tells me something about how worthy I am, I may judge other people based on the type of car they drive. If I identify myself with my job title and truly believe that like having a high salary or a certain title tells me something about how worthy I am, I may judge people based on these beliefs. So the labeling that goes on is based on what, these labels are believed to say about me in the first place. And this is something we discussed, of course, also in the session on judgments. Many of the beliefs that we have actually make up our ego. So in this final chapter, we're going to explore whether it's possible to move beyond the negative workings of the ego. And I believe the answer is yes. But before we continue, I think it's important to realize that the things the ego identifies with are not problematic. Having a nice car or not, being attractive or not, accomplishing something or not is not problematic. It is believing the story in the head that tells you that these things are who you are that is problematic. So to use the shopping cart metaphor, the things you put in the shopping cart metaphor, whatever it is, are not problematic themselves. It is believing that these things represent you, that you are those things that is problematic. And in this way, it becomes also clear that how mindfulness can be helpful here. Because mindfulness, as we saw, is about observing thoughts. And the thoughts about ourselves, the stories that we create about ourselves, are nothing but thoughts. So mindfulness can help us to observe these self-stories, these thoughts about ourselves, rather than believe them. We saw that the ego is the construction of a story about ourselves. Well, mindfulness can help you to see through this construction, to see through this narrative self, and connect to a sense of self that is beyond the storyline. And this may sound vague, but I think once you've meditated and you've seen that you can be aware of thoughts and sensations and smells and be in an observer role, you notice that there is a difference between the storyline of yourself, who you are, the stories about yourself, and the person observing those stories. And that person observing those stories, whatever you want to call it, awareness or presence, is a sense of self that is different from the storyline. So this sense of self, you could say, is far more dynamic. It is ever changing. In every moment it's different. It's always evolving. Rather than just a fixed story. And this is what mindfulness on a deeper level helps people to do, to disentangle the story about the self and another self that is almost impossible to define, because it goes beyond words and it goes beyond symbols. And we talked before about an outside-in focus. It is so typical for ego functioning. Well, mindfulness stimulates what we can call an inside-out focus, because mindfulness is all about what you feel in this moment is important. It's about a focus on the inside world of people. It's about a focus on the experience that we have. What do I feel is important? What kind of experiences do I have versus what should I feel? Or what does success means to me? Rather than what do other people believe are markers for successful living, for instance. So mindfulness is a way to connect with a self that is stronger and less dependent on the world outside itself, on the viewpoints of other peoples, on the norms and rules of those peoples. And therefore, we could say mindfulness can help to strengthen authenticity. And this is also what we find in research. So if we use the same picture that we used before to demonstrate the outside-in focus, we can say mindfulness helps us to move from an awareness of what goes on inside ourselves, what we experience in this very moment, and translate this into the outside world. So now we become the starting point of our behavior rather than the world outside ourselves. And whereas a person, for instance, to give you an example, whereas a person who operates from the ego and is strongly guided by an outside-in focus may ask himself, like, what kind of job do I need to get? What kind of jobs are highly paid or are highly valued? A person living from an inside-out, using an inside-out focus, may ask himself, what kind of job would make me happy? What kind of things can I do that, allow me to use my personal strength? What do I believe is valuable work, is meaningful work? And therefore, the autonomy and the authenticity of people becomes stronger. So to use the same metaphor and to conclude this presentation, what we can say is that when we become more mindful, it is not that we, cannot enjoy our expensive car anymore, or that we do not pay attention to our appearance anymore. The difference is that we become aware that, we are not the content of our shopping cart. We are the awareness, or the person, if you want, in this metaphor, that pushes the car around. And there is a difference between the person who is aware of those things in a shopping cart and the things in the shopping cart themselves. This was the presentation. I hope you enjoyed, and thanks for your attention.